Hello everybody, this is the Bastiat Society of Raleigh, and today is May 8th, 2024. I'd like to thank you for coming. When you register for the event, it's really helpful to us. We really appreciate your coming, but be sure to register. Definitely check us out on Facebook and LinkedIn and all that good stuff, and share the events. We're really pleased today to have Dr. David Barker, University of Chicago economist, and also basically a private entrepreneur. I'm going to let him tell you more about his background, which he knows better than I do. And he's going to talk on junk climate economics.
Great. Well, thank you. Well, thanks very much. Great to be here. So I live in Iowa, run a real estate and finance business there. I'm also on the board of regents of the university system in Iowa.
I love Caitlin Clark.
Yeah, oh, she brought her enrollment up, so she's really helping. So yeah, PhD in economics from Chicago. I worked at the Federal Reserve in New York for a while, and I've done some teaching off and on, mostly business now. But I got interested in climate because I had discussions with people, and they would often refer to research in academic journals and say, well, this proves that you're wrong about climate change. And so I dug into those papers, kind of using the tools that I had from my background in economics, and found that they were really poor quality. These are articles that are in top peer-reviewed journals, get a lot of attention, and they're just junk. So that's what I'll tell you about. This is how climate is often presented to people, that it's this terrible thing that's going to end the world, essentially. Here are a few statements. The World Economic Forum saying, runaway climate change that makes the world all but uninhabitable. President Biden saying, climate change is the existential threat to humanity. Unchecked, it is going to actually bake this planet. And he says that it is literally an existential threat to our nation and the world. So it doesn't get much worse than that. But here's what the mainstream economics really says about climate change. So William Nordhaus at Yale University won the Nobel Prize for his work on climate. And he found, using what's called the DICE model, he found that an increase in temperature of 6.5 degrees Fahrenheit would lead to a loss in 2100, so a long time from now, but in the year 2100, of about $13 trillion. That's a lot of money, right? And so that makes headlines. Climate change will cost $13 trillion. Not quite the end of the world, like baking the planet and exit, but it's a lot. But if you dig into the summary of his work in the IPCC report, they say under the no policy baseline scenario, meaning we do nothing. Suppose we do nothing about climate change. We don't switch away from coal and natural gas. We don't even mitigate the effects of warming. Well then, and temperature rises by 3.6 degrees Celsius by 2100, resulting in a global gross domestic product loss of 2.6%. Okay, that 2.6% is that 13 trillion in the year 2100. All right, so John Cochrane, a Stanford economist, wrote about this and said, well, how much does climate change actually affect GDP? That's not really the right question, because the economic effects of climate change would be dwarfed by economic growth. Now that picture was done by one of those AI illustration generators. So I typed economic growth, and that's its impression of economic growth. I thought that was kind of cool. So according to the World Bank, economic growth in recent years has been about 2.11% per year, per capita GDP growth in the world. All right. So if you extend that out 77 years from 2023 out to the year 2100, then you get a multiple of about 5. So if growth continues, then we will be 5 times richer than we are now in the year 2100. All right, so what does a 2.6% drop in the year 2100 mean? Well, you do the math here, it comes out to about 4.9. So now we've gone from existential threat, end of the world, to we're going to be 4.9 times richer instead of 5 times richer. That's not a big deal, right? That's within the margin of error of a lot of other uncertainties that we'll have to deal with between now and the year 2100. All right, so that's the mainstream economic view of climate. All right, and it doesn't get many headlines, but that's not a particularly controversial view, right? That's the Nobel Prize winner in climate economics. All right, so what climate alarmists have to do is show that, no, that's not the full story. Climate change will affect the rate of economic growth, right? So in that previous exercise, I assumed that growth was going to continue at 2.1% per capita. Well, if warming temperatures lowers that rate of growth, well, it could have a big effect, right? We could, if you shave a point or so off of the rate of economic growth, we'd be a lot poorer in 2100 than if you didn't do that, all right? So now, this is, I'm being a little snarky here, but that was about 6 years ago that they put that sign up saying that we had 12 years left. But at any rate, so that's what the strategy is. If you're really going to show that climate is a big deal, you've got to show that higher temperatures are going to reduce the rate of economic growth. So people have tried to do that. And here are some headlines showing some of these studies that have come out, and they get glowing coverage in the mainstream media, right? Wall Street Journal, climate change may deeply wound long-term U.S. growth, according to a Federal Reserve study, and so on. The press just eats these papers up, and they are, like I said, published in top journals, get a lot of citations, and are very, very prominent pieces. All right, so we'll dig into some of those papers, all right? The first one I looked at was a paper from 2019 that was a Federal Reserve paper, all right? So published by the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond. And the conclusion was that warming in the United States will cut the rate of growth by 1/3, all right? That's pretty significant. And what they did was they took state GDP data, all right, state by state and year by year, and they looked at that, the growth rates, and tried to correlate that with changes in temperature, right? So temperature, varies from year to year and state by state, and the idea was, well, let's just look at this natural experiment and see some states in some years are warmer than normal. Does that affect their rate of economic growth? And they included a lot of other sort of fixed effect variables in those equations, but it's basic, ordinary least squares regression. And they come up with the coefficients on those regression equations and extrapolate those out to the year 2100 using the IPCC estimates of how much temperature is expected to increase over that time. All right, so what they find is a negative coefficient for the summer months in the United States, all right, meaning that if temperatures are high in the summer, the rate of economic growth is lower, but a positive coefficient for the fall, which is the fourth quarter, October, November, December, all right? So that makes sense. If it's warmer in the winter, that would be a good thing. But the summer effect is larger, they find, than the fall effect, and so the overall sum is negative. So they use that difference to estimate the effect. All right, winter and spring turn out to be statistically insignificant, so they just throw that out. All right. Now, the problem is that the sum of the four coefficients is not statistically significant. And they don't report that. They don't do the test. And it's an easy thing to do. All right, they use a statistical package called Stata. Now, I know SAS is the big one around here from Perry, but very similar. And there's a line of code that is very easy to add that will do that test. And in fact, they use that test, that statement in Stata, in other parts of the paper. But for some reason, they don't do that very simple test. Is the sum of these coefficients statistically significant or not? It's not, and they don't report it. Crazy. Then I also got some different data from an economist named Robert Tamura at Clemson, guy I knew from graduate school. He came up with a history of state GDP data year by year. And so I was able to go back further in history and use that data and got temperature data, and there's no effect at all, right? So you find an alternative set of data and there's no effect, which makes sense if the original result was not statistically significant. Also found that if you pull California out, the sign reverses on their effect. All right, and California is kind of a difficult data point anyway. If you think about what is the temperature in California Well, that's Death Valley and Monterey, and Eureka. So it's probably a state that you might want to leave out of the analysis anyway. All right, but when you take out one data point and the sign reverses, that's not a good sign. All right, another paper, also a Federal Reserve paper from 2021. This one looks at worldwide data, 124 countries, annual data on growth and temperature. All right, so they did what's called quantile regression. Regular regression is trying to predict the mean of a variable. This quantile regression can try and predict the median or any percentile. So you can say, what's the effect of this variable on the 10th percentile, say, or the 90th percentile of the dependent variable, all right? And his idea was that higher temperatures are going to hurt countries that have weak growth, all right? So the effect when growth is weak is going to be larger than the effect when growth is strong, and so it's going to hurt poor countries and make disasters worse. So again, lots of complicated things added to the regression, but they're estimating 2,700 coefficients using less than 6,000 observations. Not a lot of degrees of freedom there, but another interesting aspect of it is that all countries are weighted equally. So St. Vincent in the Caribbean, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, a country I've done business in, tiny country, that gets the same weight as China, right? So small countries that have unusual economic circumstances can have a lot of weight in their results. But they find that the effect is stronger for the 10th percentile than the 90th percentile. That's the headline result of the paper. All right, but they don't test the statistical significance of those two measurements of the 10th and the 90th decile. I mean, why didn't a referee mention something about that? I can't understand it. It's the simplest thing to do. It seems like the first question that someone would ask. Well, I did the test, and the difference is not statistically significant. Okay, no mention of that at all in the paper. I also found that dropping a small number of countries reverses the result. And so you have things like Equatorial Guinea, which discovered oil, and per capita GDP goes up by 88% in 1 year. Big rate of growth, right? Well, if it happens to be a little cooler, a little warmer than normal that year, your regression is really going to load on that observation, all right? And it's going to have a big effect on things. Moldova, which when the Soviet Union fell, they had a couple of years of really negative growth. Rwanda, 64% drop in per capita income in 1 year, the year of the genocide, right? So you throw a country like that in, and, well, who knows what it's going to do to your results. But I found that dropping some of those real strong outlier observations reversed their results. I also came up with random data, which by construction had no relationship between temperature and growth, but had the overall average. Now we know that there are a lot of poor countries that are warm, right, for a lot of various historical reasons. So in my simulated data, I had that be true, that there are some warm countries that have average low rates of growth, but that there was no relationship between growth and year-by-year temperature fluctuations. When I did that, I found, using their method, using Kiley's method, I came up with the same results that he does. So results that by construction have no effect show an effect using his method. All right, another paper, and this is by probably the most prestigious of the authors that I looked at. Melissa Dell won the John Bates Clark Award. That is basically the Nobel Prize for young economists, so it's a big deal. The paper was published in an American Economic Association journal, very, one of the top places to publish. And they also are looking at different countries, 127 different countries over 50 years. And again, a lot of complicated fixed effect variables thrown in. But basically, they multiply temperature by a dummy variable, meaning it either 1 or 0, indicating whether a country is poor or not. All right, well, this is 50 years of data, and a country can only be rich or poor. All right, and I'll get to that in just a minute. But they find a positive but statistically insignificant effect for rich countries, so temperature doesn't really do much for rich countries, but for poor countries, an extra degree of temperature costs 1.4 percentage points of growth. That's a big deal, if true. All right, so remember the classification of countries as rich or poor. Well, think of South Korea. So the data start in 1960, South Korea was really poor in 1960, all right? But it was really rich by the end of the sample period, which is in the early 2000s, all right? But it's classified as poor through the whole analysis. So I made that one change of classifying South Korea as poor when it was poor and rich when it was rich, and the results almost completely go away. And when you do that for other countries that changed from being rich or poor, the results go away completely. So that one strange way of classifying countries gives them their result. Right? And then there are plenty of other things. I expanded the sample by time and by number of countries, and the results weakened significantly. They had some fixed effect variables in there for to try and control for trends in poor countries. Well, a lot of poor countries' growth rates were increasing at a time when a lot of their temperatures were increasing, all right, which kind of worked against their effect. So they throw in a fixed effect variable to take that out, all right, and their result strengthens. Dropping 13 out of 4,924 observations eliminates their result. And again, those are countries with really unusual economic growth in 1 year. And then the monthly, I was able to find the monthly data, which they don't report on, and found that the warmer months have no more effect than the non-warm months. And also countries like Rwanda, it happened to be that the genocide took place in a warm year, but the warm temperatures didn't happen until well after the genocide took place. So again, making the results just not really make sense. And then I also got alternative data on country GDP from Robert Timur at Clemson, and there's no effect at all using that alternative data source. Now, and they also look at political instability, and they claim that maybe the way this happens is that high temperatures cause revolutions and wars and changes in government, and that's what leads to this cost in economic growth. But I looked at those results, basically found the same results, that they just didn't hold up. And the final paper, now the reason I did this paper was, now none of these authors have responded to my paper, and I published these results in a peer-reviewed economic journal, and the journal sent them out to these authors in advance and said, hey, you can have all the space you want to respond, and they haven't. The only response we got was from Melissa Dell saying, well, you should look at this other paper by Berg, and they really get it right. All right, so I thought, all right, let's look at that one. All right, and so what they did, 166 countries, 50 years, and they try and estimate a quadratic function of growth and temperature to find an optimal temperature. All right, and it turns out to be, 56 point something degrees. That's the optimal temperature. And if a country is cooler than that on average, that'll damage economic growth. And if it's warmer than that, that will also damage economic growth. All right. And then they use some pessimistic forecasts of temperature increases, and again use the coefficients from those regressions to extrapolate that out to the year 2100. And the headline result is that climate change will lower world GDP by 23%. Right? That's a big effect. So one of the basic problems here is that the data are autocorrelated. In other words, temperature is related to the temperature last year, growth is related to the growth last year, and those things are also correlated spatially. Countries that are neighbors to each other have similar rates of economic growth and similar temperatures. Well, Clive Granger, who won the Nobel Prize, I think in 2003 maybe, he showed that you can get spurious results from a regression. You can get results that are not true from a regression when you're regressing autocorrelated data on autocorrelated data. In other words, temperature and growth. All right, and so there's a strong, and these data are very autocorrelated. So I came up with simulated random data and found that there's a very high probability of obtaining exactly the results that Dell obtained. And many other things, weighting the observations for size and volatility, things like that, eliminates the result, things that should have been done anyway. Many other things, also that the effect reverses, if there is any effect at all, it more than reverses in the following year. They report a median effect using bootstrap methods, and I dug into their results and found, oh, the mean result is half of the median that they report, and they never say that. They also claim that there's no difference between early years and late years in their sample because they wanted to counteract the idea that maybe countries have been adapting to higher temperatures. And I found that if you change the date where they cut the sample in half by 1 year, that their result goes away. And that's actually a more appropriate year to use because it does a better job of balancing the number of observations in the early and the late period. I mean, unbelievable stuff, I thought. The basic result from that paper is really, if you divide the world into 3 regions, right? Basically the global north and English colonies, former English colonies, Asia in green, and the global south. Well, the global south is warm on average and has had disappointing rates of growth. Asia is kind of in between on temperature and has had very rapid economic growth. And the rest of the world has had lower economic growth in between and lower temperatures. And so, well, yeah, you can fit a quadratic curve to those 3 points and claim that but it doesn't really mean anything. But that is the basic fact that seems to be driving the results. And they use all very, very complicated regressions to look at that, but it really basically comes down to that, which doesn't show any causal relationship between temperature and growth.